Here is Jan from Sankt Urban. Today we are talking with Geoff Thompson, a writer, teacher, self-defense instructor and former bouncer. Geoff is a BAFTA award-winning writer and has written 40 books, 5 award-winning films, 3 stage plays and hundreds of articles about self-defense and self-help. Hi Geoff, thank you for taking the time.
It's a pleasure.
Geoff, I read your autobiography, Watch My Back, and really liked it.
Thank you.
For those people who don't know your autobiography, could you just tell us something about the time when it was written and your life back then?
Yes, I guess you could say it started when I was working in factories. I suffered from depression. I had this massive kind of creativity that I couldn't find an outlet for. Every time I tried to create an outlet for my creativity, it was not backed by conditioning. It was not backed by false perceptions, by false beliefs. So every time I came to the periphery of my kind of reality and wanted to create something new and exciting, I was bombarded by fear and depression. So I decided to write down all of the things I was afraid of on a pyramid and confront them systematically one by one. I wanted to get desensitization to fear because I recognized that I didn't understand fear. I only knew that fear was like a prison. Every time I walked outside of my very comfortable reality, these bars of fear would come up and I would recoil back. And I wanted to inquire into that. That's what I didn't realize at the time I was inquiring. But in the Yoga Vasishta, it talks a lot about self-inquiry, about self-knowing, about understanding the self. And in Mexican shamanism, they talk about hunting for power in places of trauma. And of course, unconsciously, that's what I was doing. I was looking for my own power by challenging my old perceptions. So I wrote down all of my fears on a piece of paper, and I started to systematically convert these fears. So I confronted them. I proved that they were illusory, that they didn't exist by sitting in them. So the nature of my fear was liberated, and the effulgence and the power that was left in the fear came to me, and I expanded. So my perception changed by challenging fear. My ultimate fear was a fear of violent confrontation. So I became a nightclub doorman to overcome the fear. I think what triggered that was the fact that I was reading lots of books at the time, thinking I can't be the only person that feels this afraid. And I kept reading books that promised to tell me the truth about fear and about how to overcome fear and how to be fearless. And of course, the books fell short. They were either dishonest, or they just weren't honest, or they were just people that were telling me didn't know, or they were afraid to say what it was, or they hadn't quite articulated it. And I remember thinking to myself, and this is important because this was the genesis of everything I do, I remember thinking to myself, when I find the answers, I'm going to write them down and I'm going to share them with everybody, no matter how uncomfortable. So it was unconscious, but my initial drive was to serve other people. I didn't realize it. I just thought, I'm going to tell everybody because I'm fed up of this fear and I'm fed up of living in a prison, a perceptual prison, and I'm going to tell everybody. So when I became a nightclub doorman, I realized, of course, that I wasn't afraid of confrontation. I wasn't afraid of dying. I wasn't afraid of failing. I wasn't afraid of success. I was afraid of the feelings. I was afraid of the feelings my perceptions brought up. So I thought I need to become desensitized to these feelings. And ultimately, I need to challenge these feelings because I was having fears rise up that to things that didn't exist. I was afraid, a bit like Mesner. When Mesner was on the mountain climbing Nanga Parbat, he said he was at one stage he was afraid to go up. He was afraid to come down. He was afraid to stay where he was. He said at that moment, he said he was afraid to live. And he said, I'm too afraid at this time to be away from my wife. He was afraid of life. And that's what I felt. And I thought, I can't be afraid of everything. You know, everything can't be fearful. And I kind of realized that my fear existed as a perception, and perception can be changed. Later, I realized that 95% of my perceptions were unconscious. So I was afraid of things that I wasn't even consciously aware of. I just knew that I was afraid of them. So my job over the next 20 years was to unearth these treasure troves of old perception and convert them into a wider second self, a wider conscious net, or just to expand my core beliefs and to challenge everything. Not in an aggressive way, but just to challenge the concept that there is limitation and that there is separation. So I became a nightclub doorman initially to overcome my fear of confrontation and realise that all of my fears were just a perception, and that perception could be changed. And I spent the rest of the next 20 years challenging perceptions and educating myself, expanding myself. So I became a nightclub doorman. I wrote a book about my experiences called Watch My Back. And what made the book different was because it was anecdotal. It did talk about violence, but it was saying, I'm afraid. I'm a nightclub doorman. I became very experienced, but I was afraid. And I wasn't afraid to admit I was afraid. I thought the only way you're going to help people is to say, I'm afraid of this. So I went on the door as a second dan in karate. And I was also in the same position as everybody else. I was looking at what I was learning and thinking, this doesn't look like it's going to work in a real situation. But then I was reprimanding myself and saying, you can't say that. This is historical. Your masters have told you this will work, and you shouldn't challenge that. You shouldn't challenge the dogma. But when I went on the nightclub door and stood in front of violence with my 10,000 techniques, I realised immediately they weren't going to work. I realised immediately that what I needed was just preemption and artifice. And I went through several hundred fights just on one technique, on a right cross or a right hook. And everything else fell into support system. So the ostentation fell away under pressure. First of all, I was very disappointed because I thought I've spent 20 years in the martial arts since I was 11, and this stuff isn't working for me. And I was very disappointed. Then I thought, no, this is really good. I've found an essence. Just by looking and saying the king's not wearing any clothes, by putting this under pressure, by inquiring, I realised that there was an essence here, and the essence was very small. You could write it on the back of a pebble, but it was so powerful that when I wrote about this essence in a very truthful way, it had a rippling effect across the world. So I suddenly got this very ordinary Coventry lad who was a club second dan, suddenly acquired a worldwide reputation because I'd recognised an essence. I gave up my job eventually and became a full-time martial artist. But I got invited around the world to teach this essence. I even got invited to teach for Chuck Norris. He invited me 3 times. So I sat with Chuck Norris in Las Vegas having tea, and we talked about when he used to spar with Bruce Lee. And it was amazing. But yeah, what he was interested in was essence. And I said, well, the essence of physical combat is not difficult. You have to have a hardy mindset, but it's really just about preemption and artifice and, you know, not lots of techniques to choose from. So I started to develop my system based just around essentials. So the 2 big things I learned was, one, what works, you know, as Musashi said, there are not many ways to kill a man. You don't need to build a system around that. You don't need to. The art is fine. The sport is fine. The recreation is fine. All those things are great. They're good fun. And people should be encouraged to do them. But when it comes to a real situation and it's life and death, ostentation falls away very quickly. You don't even need instruction. You just need pressure. So that was a massive, what I learned was massive. But I also learned something even more powerful. And that was the fact that as real as these situations were, I recognised that I'd created them. I'd created these situations from a false perception. My perception was that the world could not be trusted, that the world was dangerous, and I was afraid of the world. So I put on my war paint, and I built all these muscles up, and I built this, got rid of all the prettiness, and I developed the ability to kill in 60 languages. I built myself into a machine to defend myself against an enemy that didn't really exist other than in my perception. And when I traced that perception back, I realised it'd been given to me at the age of 12. My first teacher sexually abused me and implicitly said to me, the world cannot be trusted, especially the people you love. So I went out into the world and built a reality based on a false perception. And that perception was so powerful, so strong, and my imagination was so virile that I created pubs, nightclubs, bars, fights at christenings, fights at weddings. I couldn't go out in the car without being in a fight. I said to my wife, isn't Coventry violent? Everywhere I go, there's fights. And she said, there's a common denominator, Geoff, everywhere you go. So I was really excited because that was the big essence. The big essence was, the small essence was, this is what works in a real fight. It's simple and there's no question about it. I've experienced it thousands of times. I've done it thousands of times. I have no doubt. It's very simple. The big essence was, do I want this kind of reality? Because I've created it from a false perception. Or do I want to change and create a better fiction? So I started to work on changing my perception of the world. And when I changed my perception of the world changed. So instead of standing in nightclubs and bars and pubs and believing I had to defend myself against a violent world, I created a world of literature and writing and art. So I went from working in nightclubs to sitting at the BAFTAs and writing for a living and talking and living a free life. What I discovered from that experience was free will. And free will is the ability to be able to change perception. If your perception is violent, or your perception is damaged, or your perception is poverty or illness, that perception can be changed. It's not easy, but it can be changed. Even genetics can be changed. That's what science is proving now. Everything can be changed by perception, and perception is informed by everything that we eat, everything that we drink, every conversation, every impression, every book we read, every conversation we have, everything we've ever learned, everything we remembered, everything we were born with. Perception is intuited by everything, but mostly by the environment around us. So if we can change our perception on the inside by challenging old beliefs and change our environment on the outside, the world will change. There's an old thing I like to say, the world can't be changed. Don't try and change it, but you can be changed. And when you change, the world will change. And that's been very true of my life. I've literally changed perception and changed my reality. So that was a big thing I learned. So initially I just wrote about using myself as a scientific exercise, or like on my own culture dish. I go out and experiment in the world and think, have a look at fear, have a look at what works and what doesn't work, and then I write about it and say, this is what I found. And because there was a truth in it, it had a very strong effect, and and it led me on to other places. It created a massive expansion in me. If I can stand on a nightclub door and face violence, then there's nothing I couldn't do. And if I can change my perception of the world, then I can create whatever world I want. So that's where Watch My Back comes from. And then from that, I've done another 40 books and films, and just constantly exploring, constantly changing perception all the time. It's exciting.
Was there a specific situation that triggered that decision, that change in you, or was it something that happened gradually over time?
Yeah, over a period of time, you first of all, you figure out what works, and you think, this is exciting. I know what works. I started to teach that. And at that time, my perception was that the world was dangerous and I needed to protect myself against people. But then I realized that violence that I was using as a problem-solving tool was just feeding an old perception. So the more violent I was, the fatter my perception became. Because the more I was violent, the more people came to me to fight. The more violent I was, the fatter that perception became, and the more I saw it in the world. So I just thought, is this the kind of reality I want to live in? I didn't like it. I started to see that it was impossible for me to be violent to somebody else without first processing that violence in me. And that violence left me in a very dark world, in the ninth circle of the inferno. You can't deliver violence without processing violence. And at this moment in time, people like me and you, we are in charge of 50 trillion cells. There are 50 trillion cells in us. Each one of them works to the command of our perception. So if I deliver violence or hate or anger or judgment to you, I have to process that in 50 trillion cells. It makes no sense. So I started to work on only delivering kindness and generosity and charity and love and all the things that I wanted to feel in my body. So I just looked at it. There was one particular moment. I mean, I was banging people every night, and I was in hundreds of fights, and I was really damaging people, and thought I was strong and thought I was secure. But I realised, of course, that I was massively insecure. Otherwise, I wouldn't be involved in violence. If you're secure in yourself, you don't get involved in violence. And I started to see these people as somebody's father, somebody's brother, somebody's uncle, somebody's son. I was walking down the street one day after a big fight the night before, and I saw the guy that I'd battered the night before, and he looked like Elephant Man. Whoa. And he was with his wife and children. He was just lumped everywhere. Yeah. And he was with his wife and children, and I just felt such sadness. Because the night before, he was my enemy. And then the next day, he was somebody's daddy. He was somebody's husband. And I just thought, I can't do this anymore. Then I had one particularly bad situation where I thought I'd killed somebody. I was certain I'd killed somebody. I remember driving home, fully believing he was dead. And I've been close to this a few times. And the streets were empty, and I was thinking about it. I got home. My wife was asleep. My children were asleep. I knelt by my wife's bed. By my bed, my wife was asleep. And I touched her, and I just couldn't believe how beautiful she was. And I was going to lose her. It was like the veil dropped, and I just saw the beauty of what I had. And I looked at my children, and the same thing. I just thought, these children, they're so beautiful, and I'm going to lose them. And I realised how powerful my liberty was, and that I was going to lose that. So I was brought up a Christian, but I'd kind of lost that along the way. So I knelt down and I prayed, and I said, if you let this guy live, I promise I'll turn this around. And the guy did live. It was a long night. And then I started to move away from the doors. I started to move away from violence. I started to inquire into myself, to know who I was, and recognise that wasn't how I wanted to live. I wanted to create. I didn't want to destroy. And I realised that was a choice, but that choice was based on perception. And I knew that my old perception was, I had an abandonment schema. I had a belief that the world was dangerous, and I had to change that. But to change that, it meant I had to come face to face with my greatest terror. So I had to intercourse with it. So I started to write about it, started to talk about it. I started to practice forgiveness, and started to practice, started to educate myself, started to read more, started to challenge all of the conditioning and all of the beliefs that I'd had. And as I learned more, I was just able to expand into completely different realities, completely different. But that was something anybody could do just by inquiring. Instead of believing everything you hear on the news and reading the papers, and instead of just believing what everybody else has told you, and they believe it because someone else told them, I started to challenge that in my own mind. I started to inquire, is that really true? And I knew that anything was possible. I knew that I could live any life I wanted to live if I was prepared to challenge that. And that takes a lot of courage. So my external jihad, my external fight, became an internal battle. So I started to work on changing my perception to things. And the only way you could do that is to go towards the things that you're afraid of, which became my life. So I continue to write about it.
Yeah. Do you still have contact with the people from back then?
Well, I never actually chose to break off contact. I just started to change myself. And as I changed myself, that reality fell away. I mean, when we talk about creating a reality, it was literal. Most of the clubs I worked in don't exist anymore. They've actually been knocked down. And some of the people I work with are dead. Some of them, retired. Some of them are still there. I still see them. And I still love them, especially people like John Anderson, and I bump into them occasionally, and I've got massive respect for them people like John Anderson taught me so much. But literally, I've created this reality, and most of it is either gone, been knocked down, or it's in the process of being knocked down, or it's been changed. Like one of the places has been changed into a hairdresser's, which isn't going to do me any good. But yeah, so I do occasionally see them. Yeah, I do occasionally see them. But it's that old saying, you don't leave anybody behind, but not everybody comes with you.
One thing that I must say is that Watch My Back was really an inspiring book. Your way of dealing with the sexual abuse that you already talked about was truly, truly brave. Really, I read that and I had to read that sentence twice because I was really shocked. It was like bam, like a punch in the face. But to me, the most inspiring aspect of Watch My Back was your pursuit of self-fulfillment. Like you already said, you always wanted to be a writer, but almost everyone kept telling you that it was only wishful thinking, a dream that you could never achieve. But you kept going and going, worked hard until you finally became a successful writer. And to me, that sounds like the story of Rocky.
Yeah.
Really, it's like the story of the underdog that keeps fighting and fighting and wins in the end. And in fact, one of the recurring themes in your books is the way to self-fulfillment. Two questions. First, do you think that self-fulfillment is part of the so-called human condition? And second, why is it so important to you to help other people achieving their goals?
I think, I think self-fulfillment is, I think, searching for your potential is part of the human condition. And I think the human condition perhaps can't change, but human conditioning can change. So the human condition for me has been about unfolding to my natural DNA, my natural signature. So I'm not a frog trying to be a fish, or I'm not a fish trying to be a dog. I'm not a willow trying to be an oak. I'm not an oak trying to be a summer flower. I'm trying to find my original. I have found my original signature. My search was to find that original signature, my unique self, my unique DNA, and then just dedicate my life to unfolding that. And then when I've got the proof that it's possible to access different realities, I put myself in front of people and say, this is what I've learned, this is the truth, this is the essence. So I'm afraid of teaching because part of my old conditioning is, who are you? Who are you to teach? What have you got to say? So I go out and teach a lot and pass this message on because I feel as though it's a duty. I feel as though it's my dharma, no less than my dharma. It's what I'm meant to do. And interestingly, when I teach and pass the message on, I learn more. Every time I talk to somebody like yourself, or last week I was in London mentoring some businessmen, every single day I worked with them, I learned more. I expanded more. So I recognise that at the highest level of man's development is selfless service. And at that level of selfless service, the service itself is the reward. So there is a bliss in serving, because when I serve somebody, there is a dissolvement of separation, there's a death of ego, and there's just a connection, just a bliss. So we look for that, because when if you ask me a question, I may be able to pull it from the archives, but often I'll just bring something through I didn't know I knew, and it will come through from the Akashic, or from the zero gravity field, or from God, whatever you want to call it. So in giving you information, obviously it's processed through me, I get information. In giving you expansion, I get expansion myself. So if I've discovered that my dharma is to teach, and I know it's my dharma because there's a lot of fear there. I'm comfortable doing this. I'm comfortable standing in a martial arts room. But if you put me, like last 2 weeks ago, I was in front of 250 school teachers, and I felt a lot of terror, because I'm thinking, what can I teach school teachers? But of course, I realised they weren't school teachers. They were 250 people, and they weren't asking me to teach them. They're just asking me to share my essence. What have I learned? So I said to them, this is what I've learned. And because it's a universal truth, that, our connection to abundance, our connection to potential is a universal truth. And it's coming from a place of love. People receive it. So every time I go and talk to people, especially in the areas where I feel uncomfortable, I grow, I expand. So for me, if I'm talking to 250 people, I've got 250 mirrors in front of me, and I can learn something of every single one of them. I expand, they expand. They expand, I expand. So I'm following the teaching because it's my dharma, and I'm not trying to teach people how to live. I'm just trying to show people the essence I've found. And if it's a true essence, it will be universal. Trying to show people how to find the key to where they want to be, and recognise that they are the key maker. And if you've got the keys, you can walk through locked doors. You know, you can be in more than one place at once. I'm in 6 million places at the moment. I've bilocated 6 million times. There's 6 million versions of me in the world at this moment, talking to people in forms of books, films, articles. They're out there. I just keep planting seeds. I keep bilocating, and I keep passing on essence. So at the moment there's 6 million. I've planted 6 million seeds in fertile ground. That just keeps returning back to me. Somebody like Paulo Coelho has 120 million seeds planted, 120 million versions of him working in the world, passing on love, passing on congruence. So I'm interested in not just accessing my potential or accessing God or abundance, but being in it all the time. And the only way I can do that is to dissolve any place in my life where there's separation, recognize separation, see separation, recognize it as an illusion, sit in it until I've proven it, and then expand.
What would you say is the biggest obstacle to self-fulfillment?
Fear. Yeah, but fear has no existence, but it's what stops everybody. People have a fear of moving forward, a fear of their potential because of conditioning. And some of that conditioning, and conditioning is perception. So their perception is that they're not worthy of this goal, they're not worth that, or, you know, there's us and them, there's not potential for everybody, there's not enough to go around, there's an us and a them. So their perceptions keep them imprisoned. When I went to talk in the prison in Coventry, in Leicester, I was amazed because I said to the guys there, you're lucky because you can see the bars, you can see the walls, you can see the guards. I said, most people I'm talking to are in a prison, but they can't see that they're in a prison. They can't see that their belief, their conditioning, their perceptions keep them in the prison of a bad marriage, the wrong house, driving the wrong car, in the wrong job, in the wrong body, some of them in the wrong city, many of them in the wrong country. That's perception is a prison, but perception is also liberation if we can change perception. So that's basically what I've recognised, is that if we can change perception, everything can change.
You already talked about the media and how it influences perception. Media suggests that we live in a very competitive world. What do you think about competition in modern day society?
I just think that if you've accessed your unique signature, your own fingerprint, how can there be any competition? There's only one of you. If you find out what your essence is when you're in the workplace, nobody can compete with that, because there's only one Jan, there's only one Geoff. So I have a unique signature. You know, like a rose doesn't try and compete with an oak, and an oak wouldn't try and compete with the orbit of the sun. You know, everything in nature, everything recognises that it's connected to everything. So there's no need to compete, because everything serves its purpose in the ecostructure. So if I'm trying to be somebody else and I believe in limitation, and limitation is about fear and separation, then it's usually competitive. But if I believe in abundance, which I do, I'm certain of abundance, and that, as it says in the Upanishads, if you take abundance from abundance, abundance will still remain. There's no one to compete with. I still feel those feelings rise up, and I still feel those fears, but I don't identify with them. I learn to observe them without feeding them. But again, like everybody, it does catch you. But the belief that there's competition is the belief that there's not enough. But there is enough. There's enough for everybody, because it's not like we have to go and find work or find money. We just have to create it. We create it. You know.
For years, newspapers also keep reporting about an increase of psychological problems, burnout, depression. Do you think that this is true, or are the media exaggerating?
I think I do see a lot of it. I see a lot of people who have dissonance, like cognitive dissonance. They're not being their unique self. They're not living their authentic life. And I think at some level they know they're not. and they get caught up in the reality they're in. So we create a reality, we forget we've created it, then we feel imprisoned by it. So we feel imprisoned by the wrong marriage, the wrong body, the wrong job, etc. Not recognizing that we are the creators of that reality, literally. And if we want to change that, we can change it. Not without work, but it can be changed. So I think people have psychological problems because, society does sell us, like the idea of the X factor, the idea of the lottery, the idea that it's a random universe and that we rely on luck. But that's not actually true. That's a perception. If we are able to, look clearly at the world and see true, we recognise that we're very unique in this space and that there's enough for everybody. If the belief is that there isn't enough for everybody, it's the perception that needs to change, not the world. So we can't change the world at the level of the world. That's like trying to change the film in a cinema at the level of the screen. We have to change the film at the level of the projector. If we change what's on the film, we change what's projected onto the reality. So the whole thing now is trying to encourage people to challenge core beliefs and fundamental beliefs and dogmatic beliefs, and cultural beliefs and the beliefs in separation and the beliefs in lack. Because they're very real beliefs of people, and they're creating these realities where people are in pain. So my job as a teacher is not only to say to people they can change the reality, but be the proof that that's true. So if you look at someone like Viktor Frankl, when he was in Auschwitz, and he said he got through this terrible ordeal just with purpose. He logged into purpose, and purpose means logos, it means God. He locked into love and was able to sit above this projected reality. And his purpose was, I'm going to get out of this, and I'm going to write about this, and I'm going to say to people, not that, look at this deprivation and this should never happen again. What his real message was, how I read it, was that this hellhole was created purely by perception, and that is an assault to the soul. We mustn't keep creating these infernos with our perception. Milton said the mind is its own place. It creates a heaven out of hell, or it can create a hell out of heaven. So somewhere like Auschwitz and the Nazi regime was a reality built on perception. And he was saying we have to be respectful of perception. We have to be respectful of the power of perception to create these terrible realities. But equally, if we change that perception, we can create palatial realities just by putting other better stuff on the cognition. And that will only come when people are courageous enough to challenge old perceptions and old beliefs. So what was exciting about Viktor Frankl's book, A Man's Search for Meaning, was that he was saying this reality was built by perception, and souls are being assaulted. This is torture to the soul. So we have to build better perceptions and stop buying into the belief that there's not enough and we've got to fight for it. There is an abundance. The belief that there's not enough is a perception.
You are an accomplished martial artist. You have, I think, 2 black belts, one in judo and one in Shotokan.
Oh, blimey, loads of black belts.
Oh,
when I went full time in martial arts, I was studying everything. But my main ones are in karate and in judo. Yeah.
Did your martial arts training help you in achieving your personal goals?
Yes, it did. It took me part of the way. The beginning part was about the martial element, the physical element, getting control of the physical body, getting control of the sensual body, managing fear, especially if you train for reality. And then the second part of the martial arts, which is the art side of it, which is the Budo, is where we fall into the level of the internal art, where we start to change ourselves and we start to become of service to society. So the Budo is where I am, and that's what I'm excited about. But I think it's difficult to get to the Budo without first accessing the true nature of what the martial element is and how ugly that is, how simple it is in the perception of it is quite simple. What works and what doesn't is very simple. If you read Masashi, the Book of Five Rings, You know, it's not rocket science, but we have to look at it for what it is, and it's destructive in its nature. But if we can get control of that and see it true, and recognise that we want to be constructive and not destructive, we are able to rise above it. So the martial arts, if you do it properly, the martial arts is a very good vehicle for exploring your fullest potential. Because at the highest level, you know, if you look at Ueshiba, the founder of Aikido, he talks about the highest level of being a warrior is to access love and to be the harbinger of love and to be a conduit for love, but not in the sense of you know, love as a soppy emotion, but love as a frequency, a powerful metaphysical frequency that changes everything. Because when we access love, we access our greatest potential.
Who was your biggest influence as a martial artist?
I think early on, I think it started with, like most people, it started with Bruce Lee. And then when I started to go into Shotokan, it was people like Terry O'Neill and people like Bob Poynton and Andy Sherry, some of the great Shotokan guys, you know, Ronnie Christopher. There were some really amazing martial artists, but I think Terry O'Neill was the main one. He kind of was this, you know, this amazing kind of warrior type character. I met him and became friends with him later on, but he was my biggest inspiration. So I modelled a lot of my early stuff on that. And he was the first guy to publish me as a writer as well. He published me in Fighting Arts International. I wrote an article about my experiences called Confrontation Desensitization, about confronting the fear element of training and getting desensitized to the feelings. So he was a big influence.
I really like to watch your video podcasts. I remember when I first saw a picture of you, I thought, man, he really looks tough. I think it was the cover picture of Watch My Back, where you have the knuckle duster. Then I saw one of your video podcasts, and it was also the first time that I heard your voice. And I was so surprised because you really seem like a gentle person, a nice person, and talk a lot about spirituality, and it wasn't what I expected it to be. Have you always been a spiritual person, or was it something that you developed over time?
It was there at the beginning. I was brought up with Christianity, so I was brought up in a belief in something. But when I used to go to church, I didn't see it in the church. When I looked around me at the people, they were all saying the words, but they weren't living it. So I always saw a lot of hypocrisy. So there was a lot of confusion there. But later on, when I started to explore it, because there was lots of negative stories in the press and in the world about dogma, about religion. Most people eschew religion now because they've heard horror stories, but I wanted to explore that. I wanted to explore for myself, so I started to read all the Bibles and discover for myself what it was all about. And I realised that religion really just meant, in Old Greek, it meant to realign. It meant to realign to our source, man to man, man to his source. So it wasn't about dogma, it was just about realigning. And you could realign through different scriptures, through different through different formulas, but you could also realign through nature. You could realign through people. You could realign, you know, just through washing pots in the kitchen. If you connect, you can realign through anything. You can realign through Zen. So I wanted to explore it for myself. I didn't want to take anyone's word. When people said Islam was bad, or people would say Christianity is dogmatic, I wanted to go into it and find out for myself. So I read the Bibles and I found massive learning there, massive intelligence. Once you get beyond, you know, the kind of literary, you know, when you get beyond what people are saying and trying to work out whether they're talking literally or metaphorically, and you just see what the message is saying, you get great learning. You know, I don't have to see it as what it's literally saying. The battle about, you know, the Bhagavad Gita, the battle at Gur, etc., looks like a huge battleground where people are being beheaded, but it's really, when you get into when you really explore that in depth, you know, in the 10th canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam, where it talks about the Bhagavad Gita, it describes it as the sea of nescience, the sea of ignorance. It's basically saying this battleground is just perception. It's your battle with perception. So when you start reading it, you think, that makes a big difference. And you look at, say, the Old Testament, the book of Genesis, and it says God created the world in 7 days. But when you explore and you look into the minutiae of that, you know, one of the meanings is that it's talking about man's development over 7 stages. The highest stage being the level of selfless service. We become a conduit for love. That makes sense to me. It doesn't have to make sense when they say this being created the world in 7 days. That doesn't have to make sense to me, but that puts a lot of people off, and they're recoiled by that because they can't find a logic in that. I don't need to be put off by that. I just need to look at what it says to me, and what it says to me is completely different. I'm interested in getting to my highest point of development, and at that level, you know, like someone said to me recently, oh, well, people are saying Geoff Thompson thinks he's God, and I said, Geoff Thompson doesn't think he's God, he fucking knows he's God. Because at that level of surrender, if you look at God as potential, say God is the ultimate potential, if we surrender to potential, we are potential. Equally, if we surrender to fear, what are we? We're incarnated into fear. If we surrender to the belief that, you know, that there's scarcity, that's what we become incarnated into. So when in the Bhagavatam, it says, Krishna says, when my servant surrenders to me, I have no choice but to surrender to him and serve him endlessly. And there was a great saying, I think I've got it written down here somewhere, yeah, from the Nigerian language. My friends told me this the other day, so I've written it down. Onyekwi chiekwi. When we say yes to our ki, when we say yes to our chi says yes to us. And in the Nigerian language, chi meant God. When we say yes to God, God says yes to us. When we turn towards potential and take 1 step, potential takes 10 steps towards us. So all of the faith are saying the same. At the highest level, when we surrender to God, we are God, but not as the ultimate being, but as the ultimate potential. So I mean, yeah, we become part of the whole. So when a drop of water surrenders to the ocean, it is the ocean. So it doesn't mean that people are going around saying, I am God. It's just saying that when I surrender to my potential, that's what I am. And when people surrender to scarcity and to fear and to violence, that's what they become.
Who was your biggest spiritual influence?
That's a really good question, because I've loved all of them. I mean, I've read the Quran. Muhammad was a huge influence. His life story really inspired me because he allowed me to be afraid. When he first had the revelation on Mount Sinai from Archangel Gabriel, he was shown his potential, he was shown the word, and he was so afraid he ran away and hid. And then I look at Christ in the garden, he was afraid. I look at Krishna at the Battle of Guru, etc. Arjuna was afraid, wanted to run away. They're saying even the princes and the kings were afraid, but if you turn into fear, it has no existence. So I would still say, I mean, I really love the Hindu texts. I love the Vedas, but I don't know. I just think they're all kind of names for the same thing. So I'm influenced by that feeling I access. I'm interested in that feeling I access when I go through that portal. So it's not so much whether I use Google or Yahoo. It's just what I experience when I'm on the internet. So all of them. But my focus of prayer is Jesus. That's my focus of prayer. I'm aware that I don't need to use that, but it suits me culturally. But I've also prayed to Krishna, I've prayed to Muhammad, I've prayed to, to Allah, I've prayed to Lao Tzu, to the Tao. I've hugged trees, so I can do it from anywhere. And every man's his own church. You can do it from everywhere.
What were, until now, the greatest moments of your career?
I guess the first one was getting my black belt, because that felt like an impossible thing, and I expanded. And getting my first book published had a transformative effect, huge effect, because I suddenly saw the possibility of everything. Then winning a BAFTA took me onto the world stage, so that was another big moment. So I guess they're the 3 pivotal moments within that career: getting a book published, getting a black belt, getting a book published, winning a BAFTA. They represent keys that open doors in me. So not just as the material you know, the material things that might feed the ego, but as keys that opened doors for me. That's what they are for me. If you get awards, it's just a key. It opens outside doors, so you can talk to more people. It opens internal doors, so you can expand more of your potential.
Do you have any current projects that you want to talk about?
I've got a film coming out in March called Counting Backwards, which we're excited about. We're shooting a new film called The Pyramid Texts in March, which is a micro budget, but it's a feature length. And I'm bringing a book out called The Caretaker, a book and audio called The Caretaker in June. And we're also going to Edinburgh in June with a play I did called Fragile. So my play Fragile is going to the Edinburgh Festival. So that's this first half of the year. So it's got quite a few good things that we're going to be promoting.
What do you do besides writing and teaching?
I like to walk every day. I like to read a lot. I'm a big reader. I'm very excited about learning. I spend thousands on books. I love books. But I love walking. I walk every day, sometimes twice a day. I'm a connoisseur of tea shops. So me and my wife find a tea shop every day somewhere to sit and have tea. So mostly just walking and reading and being with my wife.
What book are you reading at the moment?
I'm reading the Yoga Vashishta. And I'm reading a book. I'm just starting a book. It's about the holographic universe. So, but the main one I'm reading at the moment is Yoga Vashishta, which is all about self-inquiry. Who am I? Why am I here? What am I meant to do? It's a big, big question. Know thyself.
What would be your piece of advice for someone seeking self-fulfillment?
Recognize what it says in the Gita. The self is the self's only enemy. The self is the self's only friend. There's no one to blame. When we project out, we lose power. So it's always about coming back in. It's like being at the cinema. If we don't like the film on the screen, if we don't like what's projected on the screen, change the film. We're the film. Our cognition is the film. If you change yourself, it's no good trying to change the world. It can't be changed. If you change yourself, change your perception, the world will change. So you have the ability to change the way everything is and the way everything appears. You know, just, you know, you look at everything completely different when you change your perception. So everybody wants to change the world, but nobody wants to change themselves. But the only thing you can do is change yourself. That's what Frankl realised in Auschwitz. He couldn't change that situation, but he could change himself. And in changing himself, that situation was transformed. He was able to rise above it. And he took massive essence from that.
Well, thank you, Geoff, for this opportunity. I really enjoyed it. And, well, I hope you enjoyed it too.
I did, thank you. And thanks for asking me, Jan. Great.